The issue of deficit reduction, you all know, has been in the news. It's a major topic every day on TV. What are we going to be doing about deficit reduction? Everyone agrees that we need to do something about it, that our pathway for spending is not sustainable, and that in turn threatens our environment, our health services, our education, and our way of life. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of agreement about how to deal with the issue. President Obama, to his credit, created a National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform last February, and it was chaired by Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. Bowles, as you know, was Chief of Staff to President Clinton. Bipartisan with 18 members of Congress, and they were asked to make recommendations to try to nearly balance the budget by the year 2015. The way that it was constituted by executive order with the President was that 14 of the 18 votes were needed to report out recommendations. The idea was to try to achieve close to a consensus for any recommendation to stick in the final report, and to deliver those recommendations to President and the Congress by December 1st, just a couple of months ago. The recommendations that were needed and were ultimately suggested by people studying the issues was that deep budget cuts were going to be needed, and that there would likely need to be significant changes in some of the laws, particularly in the healthcare arena. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts by the President and members of Congress, there was some agreement, but there were also areas where there was a lack of consensus. And as it turned out, there were 11 of the 18 members who did agree on a package, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, on a $4 trillion deficit reduction package by 2020, not 2015, as you may have seen on the previous slide. And this would make good progress, but ultimately, even though it was a significant level of deficit reduction, would not solve the problem. It needed to go beyond that. So it was viewed as a good starting point for future work, even though they didn't receive the necessary 14 votes to make it a formal recommendation of the Commission. We also know that every day that goes by, the issue becomes more and more important. The gap continues to widen, and that it's expected that the President and congressional leaders will try to agree on at least a partial deficit reduction plan during the coming year. And there's ongoing discussion every day about that issue. Meanwhile, at the state level, they're suffering from the worst recession since the 1930s. I hope I'm not bumming everyone out here, but it is a bit depressing when I was jotting all this down. The decline in state tax revenues is the steepest on record. 44 of the 50 states are projecting budget shortfalls totaling $125 billion for the upcoming year. We also know that the demand for state services hasn't declined, and in some areas where people are unemployed and they have needs for state assistance, the need may have even increased. Federal aid, with the funding that was provided to try to stimulate the economy, has helped close some of the state budget gaps over the past year or two. But as you know, that money is now running out and isn't there for the coming year, which is a huge problem. It softened the blow for the last couple of years, but during this coming year, there are a lot of states that are facing a much more significant problem. And so we have governor after governor that is now facing deep cuts on top of what I would classify as easier cuts that were already made. We've had a few years now of declining revenues, of of budget shortfalls, and lots of cuts have been made. A lot of agencies that now feel that they've cut to the bone and there's not a lot left that they can do. How am I possibly going to take another 15 or 20% cut in my agency and still accomplish my mission as it relates to energy and the environment? Among those states that have projected shortfalls, the top 5, California, Illinois. Many of you may have seen reports in the media about Illinois that things were so difficult there that there was something on the news that I saw that suggested that gas stations weren't accepting state credit cards from state troopers because the state was in such a dire situation. New Jersey, Texas, New York, North Carolina is at $3.8 billion, still a very significant problem, a significant deficit. And by the way, the state of Illinois has such difficulty that they recently passed legislation for significant tax increases to try to bail themselves out of this problem, which is amazing to me during these difficult economic times that they would have a major tax package that would have passed. But they really had no choice. And then the other way to look at it is that these numbers are obviously large numbers, but I was interested in, as a percentage of the state's budget, how big is the shortfall? And interestingly, the problem is even greater than I thought for these larger states, where you typically hear big numbers, but it may be a small percentage of the total. Yet here, Illinois has their budget shortfall is 45% of their budget. Nevada, which is only $1.5 billion, is also at 45%. But the other 3 are all ones that were in the list up above. So it's a problem that is affecting large states and small, and when you look at the magnitude of it, it's truly a national problem facing our states on top of the federal deficit that we have. An example, just picking one state, the state of Connecticut, and what they're facing. This is one that was not at either extreme, but their budget is at nearly $4 billion, which is almost 20% of their current spending as a deficit. They're in their deepest financial hole in decades. Their unemployment growth has been ranked last in the country, or close to last in the country, since 1990. They currently have about 9% unemployment. Again, many of the less painful cuts have already been made. The state overall has about 50,000 workers, and about 900 to 1,000 are working for the state environmental agency doing environmental or natural resource work. The recently elected governor, who had been mayor of Stamford, Connecticut for I think around 12 years or so, was recently quoted talking about the budget and the deficit as, "It's really ugly, this deficit is a nightmare." He'll be giving an address next week, and it's been reported that he's looking to address the problem with a combination of budget cuts, but also trying to increase revenue. The plan is expected to include the following items. Consolidation of state agencies. And this is a theme that we're seeing all across the country. Governor after governor is talking about consolidating agencies. It could be 40 different agencies and trying to merge them into perhaps half or 1/3 the number of organizations. To eliminate a number of staff positions, to eliminate a lot of state programs, particularly those that are programs that are not mandatory programs. They're looking to renegotiate wages and benefits with the state employee unions. They're looking at income and sales taxes, and perhaps eliminating some exemptions. And by eliminating exemptions, you would increase the revenues that are coming in. The governor is also at the same time talking about developing revenue by having more economic development, increasing jobs, and tax receipts that will increase state revenues. He also restored funding for tourism marketing, again, to try to boost those revenues, to invest in infrastructure for construction jobs, to cut, interestingly, cut state surcharges on electric bills, which are very high. But he also wants to hold harmless education funding for local schools and have no future borrowing, which gets people into a lot of trouble. One of the things that they have done, and this is an example of trying to stimulate the economy by making changes at a state environmental agency, was just this past year they proposed a 60-day deadline for initial review and a 6-month deadline for issuance of a permit, a major air permit or water permit or waste permit. And they proposed that it would automatically be granted if the state hadn't acted, as an incentive to get the state to move faster and be more efficient and get those permits out the door. It was proposed by the state's Business and Industry Association, complaining about the amount of time that it took, but the environmental groups, as you might expect, opposed it. They noted that over the prior 2 years, the state's budget for the environmental agency had been cut 15%, and 150 jobs had been eliminated, a 12-year low, making it difficult for them to process permits faster without sacrificing quality. So you see here the scenario that state environmental agency after environmental agency is facing, where they've already lost hundreds of workers and they're not eliminating the laws that they need to implement. They're required to implement these laws that the legislature has set, and they have a huge reduction, way fewer people to do the work. Eventually they came up with a compromise to create a new office to expedite permits, but it would apply only to projects that were significant in job creation, 50 or more jobs, or were developing a green technology business, or were transit-oriented or in an area in need of revitalization. And also part of the compromise was that the time limits would be stated as goals, and that the agency would have to submit a report of explanation if those goals were not met. So it was keeping a little bit of the heat on the staff to try to be efficient, but it didn't have them pumping out permits for the sake of pumping out permits and sacrificing the quality of Connecticut's environment. You've probably heard, many of you, from Bill and others about the Environmental Council of the States, this national organization of state environmental commissioners, a partnership of EPA and the states. It's important to note, and this organization does a very effective job in Congress, of reminding people that states implement almost all of the core environmental programs in this country. Many people lose sight of that fact. In fact, I was at a meeting in Sweden with members of the Swedish EPA, and when we talked about U.S. environmental laws, they had a fairly negative impression of what they were doing in Sweden compared to what we were doing in the United States, and felt that they were superior and that the United States needed to pick up the pace and do more. However, when I started talking with them about initiatives that had been undertaken by the states and the role of state government, they were quite surprised, because they really hadn't looked at environmental protection as a national system involving both states and EPA, and you need to add the two together. And it's the total picture that you have to keep in mind to understand exactly what we're doing in this country to protect the environment, to promote a clean energy future, to improve public health for our citizens, and so on. It's quite interesting to see what's taken place over time. In 1992, 40% of the programs were delegated to the states. By 2007, 96%. Again, meaning that the states had matured and the states were running a number of the programs that EPA previously ran alone. There's still EPA oversight of those programs, but the primary implementation of the program is where the rubber meets the road, is occurring at the state level. And if you look at funding for environmental programs, in 2008, ECOS indicated that an average state budget had 23% federal funding, and that had been on the decline. 14% was state general fund dollars, and 63% was other sources such as fees. And those fees had been increasing, oftentimes offsetting the shortfalls in federal and state general fund dollars. So it's a very interesting dynamic that's taking place, and one of the difficulties that states are now facing with fees is that they've increased fees dramatically in recent years to deal with their recent shortfall, and they're at a limit, and they feel that they can't increase that much more in those particular programs, so they need to look somewhere else to help solve the problem. ECOS has also explained to Congress and others that on total, 97% of the inspections are done by states, 90% of the enforcement actions, but I also think it's important to recognize that EPA plays a significant role there as well, and that EPA tends to handle many of the larger cases and larger facilities. It's also important to recognize that many of the innovations and pilot programs were initiated by states before they became national. And in many areas of environmental regulation, that's been the case. The states have moved ahead. Oftentimes there was resistance at a national level. The states said, we need to do this. We are going to move forward ourselves. It would then be implemented in a state or a couple of states. It would then tend to grow, and there would be other states doing it. And then you eventually get to a critical mass where even the regulated community says, gee, wouldn't it be better to have one national standard than a patchwork of state requirements? Let's do this nationally. So that progression has occurred with many environmental programs in the history of this country. And states have often been the incubators for environmental programs. One of the other interesting dilemmas that the states have is that EPA is busy developing new rules and regulations for good reason. For example, in the drinking water area, there's new science, and their mission is to protect public health. They need to implement new rules for water suppliers to make sure that our children and our families are drinking healthy water on a day-to-day basis. That requires new rules and regulations to be developed. That in turn requires the state staff to help implement those regulations. So more and more pressure on the states, more and more to do, and less money to do it. And one of the real keys here that the states have always been pushing for has been more flexibility. That if they could have more flexibility in implementing the program, they could be more effective and perhaps do more with less. But one of the dilemmas for the EPA is wondering, are the states willing to be accountable for that flexibility? And will that flexibility result in a better outcome for public health and the environment? Can you measure it? There's a lot of rhetoric about, gee, we'd like to be able to do it this way, we'd like to be able to do it that way, but then if you say, well, can you set it up in a way that we can measure and prove the results and prove that your way is better than the way that EPA is doing it? Sometimes it breaks down when you get to that question, and that's been an ongoing dilemma and ongoing dialogue between states and EPA. Just this past year, there was a survey on environmental budgets that was done by ECOS. 36 states responded. There were over 2,000 positions at the state level that had been cut or were permanent vacant positions, and an additional 1,100 positions that were frozen or voluntarily vacant to deal with their budget reductions. 20 states in the survey had reduced or eliminated programs, and some of their coping strategies for dealing with these cuts was to try to make business process improvements in the way that they operated their program, shifting their staff, automation and technology, which is very important and very helpful in many cases, increasing fees, but as I indicated previously, that's more and more difficult to do, and then other obvious things such as consolidating space, creating motor pools, reducing agency fleets, decreasing travel, delaying purchases, and things like that. For the coming year, in 2011, they issued a report saying that they want a 2% budget increase, that their budget priorities had a special emphasis on core programs with multi-programmatic cross-media impacts, which I interpreted to mean they want it for just about anything. The core programs that they identified were air, waste, water, drinking water, pesticides, and solid and hazardous waste. And for multi-programmatic cross-media, they described it as things like lean techniques, lean manufacturing, lean techniques in management, mercury reductions, climate change, enforcement, children's health, data management, etc. And the unspoken comment that they really always have is, cut EPA if you must, but please don't cut us. And that's always been there. At the federal and state level, as it relates to energy, energy independence has truly been a goal for many, many years. Many of you are too young to remember this, but back in 1970, President Nixon said that by 1980, the U.S. ought to be energy independent. We have a long ways to go. Good concept, and it's been in place for a very long time. Getting there is obviously the problem. It's well recognized today, I think, that energy efficiency and conservation saves money, is highly cost effective, and provides a relatively rapid return on investment. It's an essential part of any energy policy at any level of government and across the world. We've also seen that growth in renewable generation, such as onshore and offshore wind, solar and geothermal, and even renewable fuels such as ethanol have required significant subsidies. And that's a big issue as we look at the issue of deficit reduction and budget reductions moving ahead. Hydro generation is also expected to increase. That's a significant source of energy in this country. And Hydro-Quebec in Canada and other sources are rapidly developing hydro and looking to build transmission to the U.S. to help meet our needs for increased base load while providing a relatively cost-effective and clean source of energy. So that's something to keep an eye on. They are planning to export a significant amount of energy, and I think have been watching things play out with fossil fuels in the U.S. and also recognizing the fact that base load is a significant issue. Wind is not base load, solar is not necessarily base load unless you have long-term storage. So hydro can help complement the other sources of renewable energy to help meet our needs. Coal and nuclear has remained relatively constant in this country, and replacing coal and nuclear in the long run will require a huge amount of renewable and other clean fuels. Natural gas has increased dramatically in terms of its use, especially in the New England region where I'm from. Back in the late 90s to 2002 time period, there were approximately 25 power plants that were permitted in New England. In comparison, by the way, only a couple in California, just preceding the California energy crisis. That has provided cleaner energy for New England and is now relatively inexpensive. One of the interesting things about natural gas, however, is that because it's relatively low and plentiful, it's had an impact on investment in wind farms and wind generation. At the state level, we now have 33 out of 50 states that have some kind of renewable standard that impacts generation spending for hydro, wind, solar, and geothermal. Significant investment in renewables, and the goals for renewable portfolio standards generally vary from 12 to 25%. And it's also significant to note that renewable portfolio related generation will create a huge need for new transmission lines throughout this country. One of the challenges that we obviously face, and many of you are aware of this, is that the wind is not necessarily where the people are. The large sites for solar, large-scale solar, are not necessarily where the people are, or the hydro facilities are not where the people are. So linking the renewable energy to the population centers is a major challenge and will be a major issue for this country in the years ahead, with a mixture of both high voltage AC and high voltage DC lines that will be necessary. Just one example of something that's been done in the state of Texas, where there's a significant amount of wind. It's a leading state for wind. The PUC coordinated generation, transmission, and regulatory stakeholders through something called the Texas Competitive Renewables Energy Zone. And the result is that there'll be more than 5,000 miles of transmission linking renewable generation in West Texas, where there's a lot of wind, to the population centers of Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin. Similarly, there are proposals in the Midwest to build mega transmission lines carrying wind resources from the Midwest, which is very rich in wind resources, carrying it to the urban centers in the East. These questions have raised all kinds of policy debates. Big versus small. Do we want large-scale generation, or do we want distributed generation at a small scale? Do we want our generation to be far away, or should we say, no, we want our state to be energy independent, or we want our community to be energy independent? Or do we want it sort of house by house, trying to get people off the grid, or to have every house with a solar collector and solar hot water and maybe a micro wind turbine and passive solar and retrofitting to make it super energy efficient? And so there's a certain philosophy that underlies a lot of the policy debate that's going on in state houses and in Congress as well. An example of a clean energy and climate change plan is the state of Massachusetts, which just a little over a month ago announced a plan for the state of Massachusetts. And this was requiring that the state set a greenhouse gas goal for 2020 and a plan by January 1st to try to get there. It also set a goal of 80% reduction by the year 2050. The state's plan in Massachusetts was for a 25% greenhouse gas reduction in 5 policy categories: buildings, electricity, transportation, non-energy emissions, and cross-cutting emissions. You'll see it doesn't add up exactly, but this gives you a relative sense of the ways that they'll achieve their goal. One of the major ways that they'll achieve their 7.7% electricity is through a transmission line that's proposed coming down from Hydro-Quebec, which is supported by the state of Massachusetts. And then, of course, energy efficiency and Energy Star appliances and building codes and so on. A real mix of policies, that some of which already exist. Some are expansions and enhancements to existing policies, and some that are new. We're also seeing a number of innovative approaches to dealing with energy and environmental issues, and this is just one example of many that are being developed across the country. This happens to be one that I was directly involved in when I was head of the EPA for New England, working out of an office in Boston. And this power plant in an urban setting, the Kendall Station facility, is close to the Charles River in Cambridge. It needed a new discharge permit for its water intake as well as its thermal discharge, NVDS permit. It had an impact on fish population, both related to the water intake as well as the thermal plume in the river. And it was an urban site that was limited in terms of what it could do with technology to reduce its impact. And the Charles River itself was a top priority for EPA New England. Every year there's a Charles River report card that's issued. I was involved in doing those press releases with the media to report on our progress, and I actually assigned the grade at those events. And I can tell you that while there, and the agency continues to do great work in making progress in this regard. As it relates to combined sewer overflow discharges to the Charles River, for example, using 1988 as a baseline, the court order that's now in place that's guiding, which is part of a settlement that we did with the MWRA, is achieving a 99% decrease in pollution to the Charles River. So it's improving at a rapid pace, and there's a lot of attention being paid to the Charles River as a river that is worthy of a great deal of attention, that is being reported on annually, that industry and government agencies are accountable in front of the media every year to explain how they've done. And the report cards are based on monitoring data. So the data is what it is, and if things aren't getting better, you have to explain to the public why they're not getting better and what you're going to do about making it get better. We found that in looking at this issue, there was a lot of attention being put to the difficulties associated with this permit. The owners of the plant said that the viability of the plant was in question. Technologically, they couldn't meet the limits that we were proposing, and things were at a bit of a stalemate. And then the exciting part of this is that they went back to the drawing board a bit, and everybody started talking and collaborating, and came up with an innovative solution involving steam. The big issue here was the thermal loading issue that was difficult to resolve, and the solution included a combination of both intake improvements and then having steam generation on the roof of the building and then shipping steam underneath the bridge into Boston and selling to some of the major institutions in downtown Boston, providing for their energy needs. So it was really a win-win where it provided energy improvements and enhancements in the city, but also directly improved the environment. This included fish restocking efforts in the Charles River as well, to try to reestablish the population that had been harmed by prior operation of the plant. So the idea being that things were getting better in the future as they implemented this plan, but what about the loss that had already occurred, and how do you restore those populations? So that was part of it. And the ultimate solution was a 95% reduction in both water intake and discharge of the thermal load for the Charles. And of course, obviously, clean air benefits where cleaner gas was displacing fuel oil at some of these facilities as well. So in looking at the issues that the state and federal agencies are facing, just a few thoughts on what all of this means, and I won't run through all of them because I have about 10 pages of what this all means. But the first thing is that a major reduction in the deficit, which has to happen. Everyone knows that it has to happen. That we do need deep budget cuts, as painful as they are, as much as we would like to continue funding programs at their current level. They are necessary at both the federal and state level, and we need to face up to that fact and try to find a way to deal with that in the best way possible. We also know from recent elections that's what the people expect, and that easier cuts have already been made, and what we're facing will be more painful. We also know that economic improvement, the economy, stupid, is part of the issue, and that energy and environmental policies and programs must consider impacts to businesses and the economies as part of the analysis. We also know that agency heads, like me, have been able to get by with the easier cuts and been able to do less of the same kinds of things that we're doing. But now the realization is that we can't just keep doing less of the same. It's not sustainable. And so the agencies are going, and other stakeholders are going to need to analyze, prioritize, rethink, and redesign their programs. We're entering an era of re-engineering our environmental management programs in this country and in our states. And this will obviously lead to some very tough choices, but I would also offer that it will lead to more innovation. When people have their back to the wall, or they have what seem to be insurmountable barriers, it's amazing to see how innovative they can become and creative, and to find a way to achieve close to the same goal, but in a different way that addresses the problem. A few other things that I would note as you're looking at these issues and hearing about the debates that will be in the media during the coming year or two as federal and state agencies struggle with issues. One is that everybody seems to love to talk about combining programs and combining agencies, but it's important to recognize that that often takes time, and that when you combine an organization, it oftentimes doesn't function as well as you would like to see it function in the beginning, and that it takes a while to hit its stride, and that things may actually be worse in terms of operations in the short term before they improve in the long term. It's also important to recognize that some of the initiatives, such as online permitting and licenses, again, sounds like a great idea, logical to do, but there are costs involved in implementing those plans, and if the dollars aren't there to implement them, they'll be put on the shelf, and those good ideas will not, in fact, be implemented. Another issue that I see time and time again with environmental programs and energy programs is the perfect is the enemy of the good. That many staff, NGOs, legislators, etc., they try to be comprehensive, scientifically correct, equitable, fair, complete in developing regulations and proposals. But in doing so, the cost of implementation or the political opposition may overwhelm them. Bill and I were talking earlier today about the issue of Instream flow, where there are multiple interests, multiple stakeholders involved in that issue. And in implementing a plan, you can end up with a plan that everyone hates, and it then goes down in flames. And instead, in reflecting on some of those failures that I've had, I realized that a less ambitious approach of incremental change, incremental improvement, would actually have been a more successful course of action, which didn't seem to be the right thing to do when I was dealing with the issue, because you want to deal with it comprehensively and fairly and properly, but really, had we pecked away at it and picked off a sector at a time or a subject at a time, over a number of years we could have built up a program and made adjustments on the way that would have been better for improving the environment. And interestingly, on that very issue, one of the entities that was frequently criticizing the plan was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I found it interesting that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by being so critical of every new iteration of the in-stream flow regulations, ended up helping it not pass, which then reduced the amount of environmental protection for that river. So, interesting issue, but one that was a very painful lesson for me. The issue of grant programs and subsidies, there's no question that we're facing cuts. Discretionary spending, discretionary grants are at risk, and I think that we'll see many efforts to cut grant programs and to cut subsidies. As you know, there are a number of programs, land conservation. I'm a member of the Nature Conservancy Board of Trustees, and we're looking at the future of land conservation as we're thinking of buying some important parcels of land that we want to protect, and are wondering if some of the federal dollars that would be part of the package in protecting and buying these properties, whether that money will actually be there in the future. And right now our thought is it may not be there, and we better factor that into our thinking. Diesel retrofits, environmental education, all these things are subject to more cuts in the future. In addition, the so-called non-core programs, things that are actually quite cost-effective and good for business, technical assistance, outreach, pollution prevention efforts, voluntary programs, those kinds of positions will likely be cut as well, as will Superfund dollars, which ironically will increase costs, because if you're cleaning up a Superfund site, and you're mobilizing for construction to clean up the site, if you have to keep mobilizing and demobilizing to clean up and stretch the costs out over a longer period of time, you could in effect double the cost of your cleanup because you're spreading it over such a long time frame. You're obviously going to see federal costs that are going to be shifted to the states. You'll see the state costs that are shifted to municipalities. More and more citizen lawsuits from environmental groups who feel that agency reviews or enforcement actions are not robust. I think you'll see more use of consultants for third-party reviews and some certification programs with BMPs, compliance. LSP refers to the Licensed Site Professional Program, and permits by rule will expand. Things that are a consultant will certify that the regulations have in fact been met, and that would be accepted by the state or federal agency in their regulatory programs. We're also going to see some significant issues with state personnel and bumping rights. I think we'll see more use of interns. I think despite what you may think about college graduates, I think that the future in environment and energy is very bright, and that as you look at it from a budget cutting perspective, that if you can replace higher paid staff who perhaps a higher paid person that retires or leaves the agency is replaced by a new college grad, that may actually work out very well for the agencies, where you bring in a young, energetic, smart individual, combining their talents with some of the seasoned professionals who are already there. And we had a lot of experience with that at EPA Region 1, where we brought in new college grads instead of simply replacing the more experienced staff who had left. And that was a great approach. The issue of transparency will be continue to be very important way of encouraging compliance. There will also be an effort underway to look at how labor intensive is a program. How much of an administrative burden is a program? Is there a way to make these energy improvements or environmental improvements without having so many staff who have to run the program? And so you'll see more and more interest, I believe, in efforts where you can adopt some laws or policies, achieve environmental and health benefit, but it's not labor intensive, it's not administratively burdensome. I think a great example, probably the simplest example, is our incandescent light bulbs, which are not officially being phased out, but there's a performance standard associated with it that in effect phases it out, and several other countries have done it as well. Simply saying effective such and such a date, I think it starts with the 100-watt bulb and moves down in 2011, eventually going down to, I believe, 40-watt bulbs. You won't be able to buy them in the store anymore. And that alone will provide huge environmental benefit and huge energy benefits to this country. It will avoid the need to construct some major power plants in the future by simply having a law that ensures that more energy efficient lighting will be used in houses and businesses. Also, finally, to kind of wrap up here, let's also not forget that our society always tends to be a crisis-oriented society, despite our best intentions. We all know that a strong economy and environmental protection go hand in hand and are mutually reinforcing. As we're dealing with issues regarding a crisis, the response to a crisis may end up being a positive thing, that it may have significant long-term benefits, even though it's painful when you're dealing with it. The other thing to keep in mind here is that while we're making significant progress in reducing pollution associated with fossil fuels, we know that our economy is sluggish, and that as the economy improves, our energy use will improve. Prior to the recession, depending on which part of the country you were in, the increased use of electricity, of energy, was in the range of 1.5 to 2.5%. So as the economy picks up, there'll be an increased demand for energy and electricity. And that will offset some of the gains that we've made with renewables. It will offset some of the gains that we've made with energy efficiency. And you'll likely have some governors 5 years from now who will look at the state's policy and say, gee, what happened? We built these wind farms and we did the solar and we did the energy efficiency, and they're scratching their head because they're basically treading water. They haven't made progress due to that growth that will occur after the economy accelerates again. We obviously need to look for more and more innovative solutions. We need volunteer organizations and NGOs to help pick up the slack. An example of that is something in New England that we did, which was work with local communities to encourage them to adopt to create a local energy committee in state government, so that at each community, the goal was to have each community, in the same way that they have a planning board or a conservation commission for the town or township, they would have an energy committee that would look at improving energy, both efficiency and renewables at the local level, and provide that expertise at the local level with essentially volunteers. And it's amazing how many communities have now done that. Also to keep in mind that regulated entities are not the enemy. They often feel like they're being treated that way, and that in many ways they can play a huge role in helping to achieve our goals. The issue of partnerships and combined efforts and leveraging of resources is really key. There are environmental groups who need to start working together and combine their efforts instead of doing their own thing. The same with state and federal agencies. The issue of timing. If you were to ask some of my staff about some of my quotes, they would say, Bob's always saying timing is everything. And that's always been true throughout my career. There are things that you want to do, and there are times when you can do it. And the key is to know where you want to go long range, and then be able to pick the right time to implement the pieces of your plan. And I've seen more people that have tried to charge ahead with a great idea or a great initiative, but the timing was wrong. And had they waited for the timing to be right, they would have been successful, and instead they ended up failing in that endeavor. Also, as I mentioned earlier about the issue of in-stream flow, but this relates to all of our environmental regulations. Keep in mind that successful legislation usually involves incremental change and not sweeping changes. In fact, our U.S. government is based on incremental change. If you compare it to other forms of government across the world, our model is one that tries to have change be incremental and not sweeping. And if you look at our environmental laws, yes, there are some laws that are profound, sweeping laws, but most legislation, most environmental gains are made through incremental change. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that that's a very important way to achieve our goals. And then finally, education of the public and policymakers, and not just advocacy, is really critical. And I've seen many, many situations where there were miscommunications, or people had improper assumptions about issues, and found that usually when people had a common understanding of issues, good things happened. But many instances, people didn't take the time to sit down and thoroughly educate people in an objective way, and when that happened, oftentimes they were successful. But when they just charged ahead, tried to polarize the issue, or didn't take the time to realize and understand why that other person was opposing what you were trying to do, and gaining that deeper understanding oftentimes enables you to make adjustments, sometimes very slight adjustments that allow it to move forward. That last sentence may be one of the most important lessons that I ever learned during my 20 years in government. So, I could talk for another 4 hours if you let me, so I'm going to just cut my slides at that, and very much appreciate your attention. I covered quite a bit as fast as I could. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, but would love to take some questions from the audience. Thank you.